share over the next 20 minutes or so is of interest and sets the scene for a discussion that we'll be having during the morning. So let me endeavour to share a screen. Should work like this, if I've got it right, and then pop that onto a presentation mode. There we go.
Yeah.
Are we in good place?
Yes.
So sustainable and resilient. Two words that you're hearing a lot these days. They're not the same. There is an overlap, and I hope to explore some of that. But they're both important. They both pertain to food systems, particularly in worldwide, of course. So we're talking about Europe and beyond, but I'll concentrate on Europe for now. There are huge challenges ahead, but there are many opportunities, and I'm really keen to dwell on the opportunities as much as the challenge. So just to start with, what do we really, what do we want from our food systems? Well, obviously the food security is a paramount importance, and that's arguably why food systems are often broken down into these three major components and stability across the piece. But let's not forget that we actually want a wide range of other things from our food system, other societal interests. Here are some that occurred to me. You could add to the list. You could rearrange the list depending on what you think is more important. But nonetheless, the food system delivers more than food, and we must remember that. It comprises a wide range of actors, or people, to use a more friendly word, who undertake a wide range of activities that are captured in this cartoon, and their activities are driven, their behaviours are driven by a wide range of drivers, whether they're economic or policy, emerging science and technology, and of course biophysical drivers. So we have this basic concept of the people undertaking a range of activities influenced by a range of drivers. Now that's all very straightforward. The important thing is that this set of activities transforms materials, changes the materials from what comes off the farm or out of the ocean into something that you and I call food. It's absolutely crucial because, to put it bluntly, I don't want to eat wheat, I want to eat bread, and I'm dependent on a whole range of activities and actors to get that bread on my plate for my breakfast this morning. In amongst all that, of course, there's a wide range of livelihoods and massive value addition. The value of the wheat in the bread I had this morning is perhaps 8 or 10%. 90% is everything else, and that's great. That's an economic machine. What does this machine deliver in Europe? Well, we've got about 750 million of us in Europe, and alas, we've got about 3% who are hungry, to use a simple word. Insufficient calories from quite often, certainly insufficient nutrients. 22 million people in Europe don't have enough to eat on a regular basis, calorifically. We've also got an alarming number of people with insufficient nutrients, even though they might not be hungry. One data I found was about 20% are vitamin D deficient, just vitamin D alone, let alone all sorts of other things. And of course, we're all aware of over half of us with excess calories. And don't forget that many of those with excess are also insufficient nutrients. So this triple burden of malnutrition, hunger, insufficient nutrients, and excess calorie has been known and discussed for some time. A big report from IFPRI 6-7 years ago. But the salutary fact is that less than 40% of the European population is actually in the sweet spot, in the green circle. So we don't have a particularly handsome record for our food security in the classic sense of the definition. We're also aware of the environmental footprint across Europe. About 9 million tonnes of soil are eroded annually across Europe. We know that 10% of our fresh water is extracted, and depending on where you are in Europe, you'll either live in a critical or highly critical water sensitive area. A lot of that abstraction is for agriculture. We know that Europe's biodiversity is in a pretty poor state. 75% of species are in poor health, according to the EU strategy document. And of course, we know about fishing, and of course the European fleet travels the world, and we've got about a third are overfished and approaching getting on for 2/3 are fully fished. So not a very good situation. And then of course we have pollution, chemicals, plastic, litter, all those things that we can see around us, but we have so little handle on controlling. Then most recently, about a year ago now, the big paper came out in Nature Food, which actually estimated about a third of global anthropogenic greenhouse gases coming from the food system. Before I read that, I was working on about a quarter. So this was a very precise and good analysis. We don't have enough concerns. There's also a host of ethical issues around our food system. The obviously intergenerational environmental legacy is very much in the fore at the moment. But again, look down the list. You could add your own issues. You could cross some off if you don't think they're important. You could put some in red and bold. Depends on your worldview. And then if that's not enough, we also have very current concerns about animal and human interactions. So here we see the green is the human population, the blue, the wildlife, and the pale yellow, the managed livestock. And the interactions are populated with a large number of diseases, a little small to read, but believe you me, you don't want any of them. And of course, here we are in a major pandemic, and of course, there is a big debate as to where that originated. But the antimicrobial resistance is a increasing concern, and about 80% of antibiotics are used in the animal livestock industry. Of course, a huge number are used in human society as well. They're not always used in a sensible way. Over-prescription. So animal-human interactions, ethics, environmental degradation, and health-related concerns with too much food, increasingly the case. So here we have our activities, and what we need to do is balance of what we do, the activities of what we do, with what we want from the food system, but what do we actually get? We obviously want our food security. We want a wide range of other socioeconomic outcomes, employment, health, you know the list, and we want a healthy and benign environment. Great. There are trade-offs, massive trade-offs across the piece. We often strive for socioeconomic betterment at the cost of environment. There might be a particular community striving for better environmental conditions, and that's certainly going to change the affordability of food. And wrapped around all that are social issues, the notion of wealth and health and employment and equity. So it's a challenge, but there are synergies, and the game plan is to better manage the food system so that we capitalize on some synergies, being aware of the trade-offs. About 10 years ago, political, scientific and societal concern began to change in relation to shocks and stresses. You remember the food price spikes. We'd seen and we were well aware of the gradual or sometimes sudden change in demography and in geopolitics, extreme weather and climate, etc. But it began to emerge that a new agenda was actually needed. It wasn't just the sustainability agenda. Sustainability had been an absolute important concept for decades, but it's not quite the same thing, and it needs more forward thinking, more preparedness, rather than managing the current situation. But most fundamentally, it was beset with uncertainties, and how do we handle that? So this was a realization that we were thinking about something in addition to sustainability. Then we had some shocks, and most recently another terrible shock. And so the big question in our minds is, what's next? What actually is coming down the track? So in order to frame the discussion around this new emerging concept that's termed resilience, we need to think about four framing questions. It's all very well to say we need greater resilience, but resilience of what? What are we trying to make more resilient? And then, of course, resilience to what? What is the nature of the shocks and the stress? And you might think, well, that's great, let's answer those and everything's fine. We know what we're talking about. But no, what's important also is to frame it from whose perspective. From whose perspective are we considering resilience? We'll look at that in a minute. And the fourth question, over what time period? And again, that depends on where you position yourself in the food system. So answering these four questions is absolutely fundamental to framing a sensible conversation about resilience, so we all know what we're talking about. It sets a boundary, and the boundary requires negotiation amongst those involved in the conversation, and what's in and what's out is largely dependent on a matter of worldview, but also where is the data to support an argument. So we've got to get these answers on the table. Of what? Are we talking about the resilience of the food system activities, the doing words, what we call the functioning of the system? Or are we actually more interested in the resilience of the outcomes, what you might call the function? And one of the things that have emerged in our work over the last few years is a very clear separation between the functioning, how it works, and the function, what it delivers, what we do and what we get. And this has been hugely helpful because immediately we say, okay, we are now going to be talking about the resilience of the food system outcomes, because that's what we want. Whole range of interacting stresses and shocks. Stresses on the left, normally a pressure slowly building up. In itself, it's not a surprise, but it's no less worrying. Whereas on the right, sudden surprising events, which just come out of the blue. They're not inconceivable. We know what these things are. We just don't know if and when and to what degree they're likely to happen. Underpinning it all, of course, science, technology, and alas, geopolitics and conflict. So to what? Got to be clear about what we're trying to build resilience against. Then from whose perspective? Well, is it just the food system actors, the people, noting that we are all on that diagram because we are all consumers? Is it from the perspective of somebody working in a supermarket, working in retail? Is it the perspective of a fisherman on the ocean? Whose perspective are we talking about? Or actually, is it from somebody else's perspective? Is it from the perspective of overall policy formulation, or the third sector, or even society at large, or investment houses? So one has to be very clear from what's the framing, what's the worldview that's governing the conversation, and then over what time period. Here we differentiate between a short-term shock, an interruption, which could be, for instance, just-in-time groceries delivery. An IT malfunction can be disastrous. And so in terms of that operation, that activity, the time frame could be 36, 48 hours. If you're involved in agricultural activity, the time frame could well be a season. And that could just interrupt your activity. Or do we have longer term disruptions, changing in dietary preferences or gradual change in energy price, for instance? Again, they're not surprises, but nonetheless important. So over what time period? So we've got to get these four questions: of what, to what, from whose perspective, and over what time period agreed in our conversation, so then we all understand what we're talking about. So be it. Now, what do we do about it? Okay. Different ways we've conceptualized of enhancing resilience, and this is coming from the Resilience of the UK Food System programme, the 5-year effort that's just come to an end. First up, robustness. Fairly obvious word. A lot of people immediately think of robustness when you talk about resilience. And there we're aiming to resist disruption to our existing food system outcomes. We like what we have, we don't want it interrupted. So we make it a strong and defensive system around it to withstand any shock or stress, make it robust. The second approach is what we call recovery, which is where we aim to return to the existing, or I should say the previous food system outcomes after the disruption. So we like what we had, we want to get it back. How do we do that? The third one, I think, is the most interesting. And this is where we aim to accept alternative food system outcomes before or after a disruption. We know what we get at the moment, and we're happy to accept something else. That might be less of something, it might be more of something. It may be a different timing, it may be a different nature. So accept alternative food system outcomes, not the status quo. We are dismissing the status quo. Whatever approach we take, the 3 R's as we call them, robustness, recovery and reorientation, requires adaptation. And this is crucial. We have to adapt the food system activities in order to derive a different outcome. Now, we can either adapt our activities to maintain or return to the food system outcomes. Now, that obviously enhances resilience, but it is fundamentally unsustainable. We cannot forever put more bricks on the top of the wall to make it taller. We cannot forever have a bigger and bigger pumping system if the land is going to be flooded more often. It helps with resilience, but it is unsustainable. The interesting thing about the reorientation is that we can adapt our food system activities to transform the food system outcomes. So we adapt the activities to transform the outcomes. We transform the outcomes away from the status quo, so we can improve something. We can have a better outcome, better animal welfare, whatever it is you're interested in. And that's really the reorientation. We're reorienting our views of what we want and what we can accept. And the really key thing about reorientation is that it can enhance resilience, but also enhance sustainability. So the reorientation strategy is really the one to put your money on. What's this mean for sustainable food systems? Well, you may recall this big Lancet report, aim for healthy diets from sustainable food systems. It dismissed the notion of sustainable diets as such. What we actually want is healthy diets from a sustainable system. So the healthy outcomes, healthy diet has got to have these attributes, but perhaps the most important word is sufficient. So we need sufficient food, which means not too little, but it also means not too much. But then we need a sustainable food system, and this is where it depends on the activities. The activities have got to be sustainable, environmentally and socially sound, but also viable from an enterprise point of view. So a sustainable food system has to satisfy environment, social and economic goals, not just environmental goals. So then we've heard the call for food system transformation. It's in the opening sentence of this workshop brief. Transformational changes are urgently needed. Yes, we all subscribe to that. This big report from the Inter-Academy panel, providing healthy, affordable diet require a radical transformation of the system. Yes, okay. But what does that actually mean? What does transformation of the system actually mean? What are we actually trying to transform? And I really think this is important, because it's a wonderful thing to say we need system transformation, but you know, what is the system? What does transformation look like? What are we trying to transform? So to help, I argue that we're trying to transform the food system outcomes from state A to state B. That's what we're trying to transform. We're trying to transform the outcomes, better food security, better working conditions, better animal welfare, and on goes the list. And this has been a really important point that we're trying to make from the program, the 5-year program. The literature has a wide range of terms and uses of those terms. And what we're trying to do is cut through the fog and say, let's be clear. We need to adapt an activity to transform an outcome. So this is what we're trying to transform. We're wanting to transform the socioeconomic outcomes, the environmental outcomes, and the food security outcomes from state A, not good, to state B, better. In order to do that, we have to adapt the activities, because outcomes don't just spontaneously transform. They only transform because the activity that derives them has itself been adapted. And adapted to what? Adapted to the social drivers, economic drivers. And so if we actually want to transform the outcomes, we actually need to reorganize the drivers. That will cause the actors, the people undertaking their activities, to respond to the new signal. The activities will adapt, and the food system outcomes will be transformed. So it's a very simple, logical sequence, but a lot of people say we need to transform the activities, and we argue no, you adapt the activities, because what we're trying to transform are the outcomes. And the activities don't just spontaneously adapt, they only adapt in response to a signal. A better business opportunity, or the threat of a sugar tax coming along, or whatever it is. So, paper just out, Webb et al. Achieving transformation will require a major shift in mindsets, especially regarding possible futures versus the status quo. We're dismissing the status quo. We're looking to accept alternative outcomes. This really means that transforming the outcomes from state A to state B, which is in effect the reorientation strategy for enhancing resilience, while also enhancing sustainability. So just to conclude, we've got a big challenge on the plate. Better food security, minimizing environmental degradation, but maintaining vibrant livelihoods and enterprises. And that's a challenge enough, but of course it's against this background of stresses and shocks, and shocks, as we know, can come with a hell of a bang. So why is it so hard to make progress? Well, we have a complex adaptive system, a socio-ecological system, lots of drivers and feedbacks, still very siloed approaches in our thinking, and this business of dealing with complexity and uncertainty is not good enough yet. We've got a wide range of actors and activities who have a wide range of power and vested interests in the system, and often they like what they have. They would be very keen on a robust system to prevent their power base being disrupted. But perhaps fundamentally, and most importantly, we have fragmented governments across the piece. We aren't good at managing the complexity of the food system dynamic. But to close, there are many opportunities. There are many opportunities for technical options for change, but I wouldn't put all my money on that, because what it often needs most is a change in policy, in economics, in cultural behaviours and social fabric, social construct, supported by technology where appropriate. Many opportunities for better negotiation and cooperation. It will need negotiation, because with any intervention there are winners and losers, and the landing ground for the losers has to be prepared before the intervention is implemented, or else it backfires. And there, of course, there are many plausible futures. It is not all doom and gloom by any means, but it does need better governance, it needs better management of power and vested interests, and it needs a better understanding and ability to deal with complexity and uncertainty. I will close there, and I hope that is a useful scene setter to kick the conversation off.
Thank you so much, John. That was great, and what an enormous amount of information in 20 minutes. I was wondering if anyone has any small questions for clarification, as we will have some time for the sort of wider panel discussion later, but if there's anything burning now before we go to the next speaker. No? All right, well, that's great. Thank you so much, John. Then we will go on to our next speaker, who's Dr. Simone Smit. Simone is actually a chemical engineer by training and has specialized on life cycle sustainability. And she applies her knowledge to study how we can ensure healthy and sustainable and affordable diets for all, but has a particular interest in the role of sustainable food production, supply chain technologies, and the circular economy. And she also does a lot of public engagement work to bring her science to the general public. In our talk today, Simona will take a systems thinking and circular economy approach to talk us through her vision on key ingredients and essential changes that would bring about sustainable food systems in Europe and beyond. So the floor is yours, Simona.
Thank you very much, Pauline, and thank you, John. I was just trying to edit some things that you have already mentioned, John. So just to keep it short, when, like, for example, when John showed the food system, we already see this sort of almost like a linear approach in terms of the actors, where we see the farming, then manufacturing, retailer, consumers, and waste disposal. So sometimes it's quite difficult. I guess before the pandemic, it was difficult to see the actual extent of the food system, where we see all the interactions between nature, society, health, and economy. And sometimes that is perhaps very well connected with this sort of linear approach, this sort of take, make, use, and dispose, that perhaps has sort of blurred the opportunity to actually think in a more holistic understanding of the food system, which perhaps has deepened or even believed that has been created these sort of problems related to food insecurity, inequity, and pure access to food, which has sort of diminished the ability of individuals and communities to meet their needs in terms of food. So if we think about that, it's easy to say perhaps that the food system is broken. It has threatened the biodiversity, has polluted the environment, and also has impacted our health. And for example, some reports have shown that this sort of broken system is a reflection of perhaps like a very easy access of highly processed food, high calorific, and perhaps low nutrient value food. We also see a lot of or very high levels of food waste and food losses along the food system. We have a lot of problems, like John also showed, about animal welfare, human health, food safety. And also we have seen an increased amount of resources use and environmental impacts created along the food supply chain. And lastly, we also see a lot of problems accessing markets, in particular for small holders and small farmers. So, for example, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has estimated that for every dollar spent on food, $2 are worth of health, environmental, and economic costs are created. And half of these costs are resulted from the way that food is produced, and also the amount of waste has been created and the lack of good handling of byproducts. And that is how we connect a little bit with circular economy. So how we change this linear approach. And basically we are looking at closed loops of nutrients and materials. So how we can maintain these flows in the system to enable more regenerative perspectives, where we can perhaps take care of the soil as well as producing better food and increasing its nutrient loops. We also talk about recovering and creating value of byproducts. So again, we maintain these nutrients and materials in the system, and perhaps diversifying the production of food, which will probably enable the diversification of food consumed from different populations. So that are sort of the main core aspect of circular economy in relation to food. And they have been identified 5 different benefits. Again, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is the key and the leader on the implementation of circular economy practices, where these main benefits are connected with, like maybe John also connected with the redesign of our system that will enable tackle climate change, maybe reduce the diversity loss, so improve diversity and promote human health while reducing the cost of in the society. And that also might enable the increasing the accessing to food, the collaboration and participation in an inclusive food system where we can tackle as a society and collaborate within that also connect this sort of circularity and closed loop, where it's not just about material flows going along the food system, but the interaction of the different actors and the interaction of the different systems. So these benefits are connected with the regeneration of natural systems through different, for example, agricultural practices. We are also talking about combating climate change. So changing the system in a more circular way could reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of our sector that, as John reflected, consists of 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2050 through mainly the soil sequestration and therefore soil sequestration of carbon through these different changes in practices. Can also improve the access to nutritious food through the integration of the different actors, perhaps like creating like more local food system, as well as maintaining these different nutrient cycles along the supply chain, as well as creating value for these byproducts. And this will enable the support of local communities and local initiatives, as well as global ones, through perhaps containing the small farmers and local businesses, and that will create money and value along the food systems. So I think I am along my 5 minutes, so I can move to our next speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Simona. That's great. Are there any questions for clarification? All right. If not, I will introduce our next speaker, which is, and I'm very pleased to announce her, Dr. Franziska Gaup. Franziska has a background in economics and worked several years at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, or IIASA, in Vienna, where she focused on system risk modeling. But more recently, Franziska became the director of the Food Systems Economics Commission, or the FSEC, which is a collaboration between EAT, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, or PIC, and the Food and Land Use Coalition. And there she collaborates with many experts to explore pathways towards sustainable, healthy and inclusive food systems. And today, Franziska will talk us through linking the academic and modeling side of the discussion with policy making and give her views on the role of policy bundles within this context. So the floor is yours, Franziska.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pauline, and thanks for inviting me. And good morning to everyone. So yeah, within the Food System Economics Commission, we are really looking at food systems transformation. So thanks, John, that was a great introduction to the topic. And we look at it from pathway modeling to policy and to political economy analysis. So I'm going to share a few reflections on that. And John and Jimena have already mentioned many of the food system impacts, so I will just very quickly go over that. But I think it's really nice because just yesterday, the IPCC Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability was published. So of course, the food system has major impacts on the climate system. It's actually, it amounts, the food system greenhouse gas emission amount to around 1/3 of total anthropogenic emissions, as John already mentioned. But I think also fortunately within the climate change debate, people are getting more and more aware of the huge role that the food system plays in achieving the Paris Agreement, for example. So you could see that already a little bit this year at the COP in Glasgow, and next year it hopefully will even be discussed more prominently. And it has also been mentioned the food system emission arise really throughout the food value chain. So from production, livestock production, to land use change, deforestation, along the entire supply chain, through food processing, packaging, retail, household consumption, and then food waste. And again, it's not just about the emissions. Agriculture is also the largest driver of biodiversity loss. And as John introduced very nicely, it has several pillars of impact. So a second impact pillar that we look at in the Food System Economics Commission is health. So the Western diets currently result in overweight, obesity, non-communicable diseases such as diabetes. And sustainability in food systems, I think, is often only seen as environmental sustainability, but it's really meant in terms of planet, health, and people. So they are important inclusion considerations. And I have to say, in our modeling world, we really realize that inclusion specifically needs more attention. So it has been shown that healthy diets, as estimated in the Eat Lancet report, are actually too expensive for many people, and studies have estimated that currently healthy diets are unaffordable for approximately 3 billion people. And livelihoods of farmers need to be maintained, so it's also about the jobs. And as economists, we call those negative impacts on the environment, health, and inclusion food system externalities. And important tools to help us to monitor and manage the food system externalities are, on the one hand side, data, so the emissions data, for example, but also bioeconomic food and land use model that are able to project different scenarios and pathways into the future. So in the IPCC, such pathways are used a lot, and many different models are there compared in so-called model intercomparison projects. In 2020, there was a special report, IPCC special report on land, in which different food and land system models were then intercompared, and the report explored different pathways that limit the warming to 1.5 degrees through land-based mitigation and land use change. John has also mentioned the Eat Lancet report that showed that it is possible to feed the global population with a healthy diet within planetary boundaries. And in those pathways, it is important to understand that those objectives, health, environment, and inclusion, are not to be achieved or treated in isolation, but they're really interlinked. And I think that became also very clear in both John's and Ximena's contributions. There are synergies and trade-offs between those objectives, between food security and nutrition, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability. And to provide an example, in the global north, reducing red meat consumption and moving towards a plant-based diet improves both health and the environmental footprint. And so what we do in our modeling exercises is that we really look at those interlinkages, and we compare so-called business as usual scenario with a sustainable food system scenario. And we identify a number of so-called measures, for example, dietary change, improved technologies that will help to close us the gap. And if that's okay, I would share one single slide. Oh, and I'm actually not sure.
On the top next to the leave button.
Yes, okay, sorry about that. Is that visible? Excellent. So what you see here are the timeline 2020 to 2050, and in the Food System Economics Commission we have developed the Food System Transformation Framework, and this is a simplified version here. We have the pathways to business as usual and a pathway to food system development pathway to a sustainable future. And what is really important for us is that we link those measures that we identify, the dietary change and innovation on the one hand side, with taxes and regulations and the policies on the other hand. So we need to identify the right policies to help us achieve the measures. And there is a vast area of policy intervention that countries can pursue to achieve their thing. I stopped sharing now, or do you still see the sharing?
We still see your slide.
Okay, that's excellent. So there are different policies, for example, policies that change incentives on the one hand side, taxes and subsidies. There are also structural measures, so investments in infrastructure, for example, or behavioral interventions, for example, education programs, nudging, and regulations. And in FSEC, we are currently building a global food system policy database where we try to list all the different available food policies around the globe along the value chain. In general, there are both supply-side measures that foster sustainable production and demand-side policies that target consumer behavior. And the question is now, how should policymakers go about designing the policies that are coherent across the dimensions such as food security and nutrition, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability? Coherent policies means that the design of different policies takes into account the relevant interactions and that the coordination takes place to achieve a desired policy mix. And it's in general also really important to mention that policies are very context specific, and it's really difficult to generalize. So it's always worth looking at different case studies. Coherent policies are also linked to governance within food systems. So how do stakeholders agree or disagree on objectives? And for example, different ministries are responsible for different measures. And here in Germany, we have just a new government where both the Environment and Agriculture Ministry are now led by the Green Party. And before it was a bit more difficult for them to work together, but now they seem to share the same goals. And same as for measures, the policy design may face synergies and trade-offs. To give you an example here, regulations to improve animal welfare may increase the price of food, which then tends to disproportionately impact poorer households. So we have to look at the interlinkages here and the trade-offs. And to mitigate trade-offs and increase the public support, we need so-called policy bundles or policy packages that address the different objectives like livelihoods, environmental sustainability, and health. And when we design those policy bundles, it's also really important to pay attention to behavioral aspects, because not all of the policies receive public support. Maybe some of you remember meat-free days in public canteens were suggested, and that was strongly rejected by the public. And generally, studies found that market-based instruments, such as taxes, receive less public support than government regulations. So people prefer mandatory reduction in salt in foods or advertisement bans. And in general, one can say that people prefer so-called pull measures, such as discounts on environmental friendly products, than push measures that discourage undesired behavior, such as taxes on environmental harmful goods or the prohibition of use of them. And bundling can also help to mitigate trade-offs between political feasibility and effectiveness. So studies have shown that citizens tend to support policy bundles if they include discounts then on alternative products. So a tax on meat consumption should always go together with a subsidy for fruit and vegetable. But altogether, I also have to say that there is still very little research on policy bundles, so there's a lot to do for us in FSAC. And to summarize my comments, for a successful food system transformation, it's important to go really the entire way from global and national modeling exercises that set health, environment, and inclusion goals to explore pathways and identify those measures that keep us on those pathways. And then it's important to design policies that help us to achieve those measures. And to make policies successful and have them accepted by the public, the policy design needs to pay attention also to political economy consideration, for example, compensating losers, and to behavioral aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franziska. That was really interesting. Do we have some questions for clarifications to Franziska?
It's John here. I'd like to pick up something in the general discussion.
Sure.
It's really interesting, that graph, and the vertical line down the middle, to my mind, separates the drivers on the right from the activities on the left. Let's discuss more in when we get to it. That's what I'd like to talk about. Excellent talk.
That's great. I've made a note there. Thank you again, Franziska. So then let's go on to our next speaker. I hope she's on the call. Anna, are you there? Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, I see you already. So our next speaker, Anna Taylor, has a tremendously long CV. I can probably talk longer about her CV than I've given her to speak today. Yeah, it's a long list of pivotal contributions to sustainable food systems. So Anna worked for many years for several international organizations such as Save the Children and UNICEF before joining DFID, which is now called the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, where she led the policy team on nutrition. But currently, Anna is the executive director of the Food Foundation, and we're very pleased she found some time in her busy schedule to join us today. Of course, before I give her the floor, I have to mention that in 2014, Anna received the great honor of being awarded an OBE for her work to address the global burden of undernutrition. So I'm very excited to hear from you, Anna, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. Pauline, and it's great to be here and to be alongside these other fantastic speakers. So I wanted to make a few comments from a policy perspective. I've just spent the last couple of years working very closely with the development of a national food strategy for England here in the UK. This was commissioned by government as an independent review, and so been thinking a lot about how you can move the policy agenda forward in trying to deliver this sort of transformation in food system outcomes, which John set up so clearly in his presentation. And I think my starting point really is that I think that at the heart of the policy challenge here, when we're thinking about transforming these outcomes, is a dietary challenge. And why I think that's the case is because if we look at the big challenges that we're trying to grapple with, whether they are related to greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, to some extent animal welfare and public health, and food insecurity at a sort of household level, those factors all can be kind of mediated through, if you like, diet and our consumption. And so if we're able to think about how we shift diets and think about the policy interventions needed to shift diets, then we're going to be in quite a productive space for transforming those outcomes. It's not going to solve everything, but it will get us a good way. Of course, if we're thinking about, I think there are sort of 4 key pillars really of that dietary change that we need. We need to think about meat reduction, because we know that if we eat less meat, we'll use less land. That will in turn have knock-on impacts on biodiversity, will reduce our carbon emissions, will also potentially have impacts on animal welfare. If we can increase our fruit and veg and fibre consumption, ideally replacing some of that meat with those areas of the diet, then we can have dramatic impacts on public health. And if we can reduce the amount of junk food we're eating, high fat, sugar and salt foods, however you want to classify them, similarly we're going to have a big impact on BMI and healthy weight, and therefore knock-on impacts on a whole range of non-communicable diseases. So I would argue these are the question for policymakers is how they think about dietary change, and this is a really difficult area if you're a policymaker, because historically we've left the whole area of sort of choosing what to eat to citizens, and it's the private sphere, it's how people play out their social values, it's how they make their relationships. They don't want meddling from policymakers in this quite private sphere, and policymakers don't want to go near it. There are, I mean, there's sort of 2 big kind of narratives which are playing out, at least in the UK, around diet at the moment, of the nanny state. So we don't want the government intervening in what we eat, the nanny state arguments, and then we've got really a kind of quite entrenched culture war going on around meat and the extent to which meat reduction is something which we should all be thinking about. So this makes it a pretty hot area for policymakers. And so the challenge, I think, therefore, for policymakers is how to think about their role in supporting citizens to shift diets, and how they talk about that role, and how they engage with citizens in thinking about their role as policymakers in supporting citizens on that journey. And of course, talking and therefore making these issues really salient to the public, which they, in many aspects of this diet debate, they are very salient. When you talk to citizens about sugar, they have a very different set of arguments and sort of demand for policy intervention than they do, for example, if you talk to them about meat. You've got to, but there are opportunities to build on. So I think that's the challenge, is how we think about, how policymakers think about diet, and getting into a place where they can see that the role that they have in making it easier, not in any way restricting choice or imposing choice on citizens, but making it easier for citizens to afford and eat healthy and sustainable food, making that the easiest option at every turn, whether that's what's being advertised, whether it's what's in a particular range in a supermarket, or what's appearing on a high street. and what kinds of measures they can introduce to begin that journey, recognizing that journey is going to take time. Also recognizing that time is not on their side as policymakers. When you know, we've heard presented here the scale of the impact of the food system on the environment and contributing to the environmental crisis, but similarly the scale of the impact in contributing to the public health crisis, which is making health systems unsustainable. I mean, in Britain, it's certainly making the National Health Service completely unsustainable over the next few decades unless we deal with diet. So and I would say there are sort of 2 points where we need to start, policymakers need to start about thinking about that intervention. The first is relates to some of the points that Francisca made about setting out clearly what our expectations are of the food system. Thus far, we've only really expected the food system to deliver productivity, jobs and national food security. But we now have a different set of expectations of the food system, and setting that out clearly in a legislative format which allows you to survive electoral cycles. Setting out that purpose is a really vital first step. It's only a small first step, but it sets the North Star. It allows businesses, citizens, everybody to see what we want our food system to deliver. And then secondly, I think getting to a position where the government or policymakers feel more comfortable in intervening in the economics of the system and changing the incentives, which again many of the speakers have talked about, through fiscal measures, because at the moment the economics of the system are all tilted in the wrong direction, so that the wrong kinds of diets are the most affordable and easiest to eat, and therefore the economics of the system has to change, and therefore the confidence that government has in intervening fiscally, whether it's through taxes or subsidies or different combinations of those depending on the context, is a vital sort of next step. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was great and very insightful. There was a comment on the chat I saw. Is that something to take? I think it's probably something to take in the panel discussion later, Michael, or is it a question for Anna? Michael?
Yeah, it's a comment about the
discussion.
Okay.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead, Anna.
Well, no, I was very much talking from a kind of a European perspective in my comments. Absolutely, the points there made around dietary change are not globally universal. So yeah, totally, but we can come into that in the conversation.
Sure. All right, thank you very much, Anna. Then our next speaker is Dr. Sergei Smetana. Sergei is a sustainability expert with a focus on food cyber physical systems. And for his work, he combines his background in biological and environmental sciences, socioeconomic geography and engineering, which allows him to apply a more systems thinking approach to sustainable food systems. And currently, Sergei is the head of the Food Data Group at the German Institute of Food Technologies, where he focuses on alternative food sources, life cycle assessment and cyber physical systems. Today, Sergei will share his knowledge on novel protein sources and their role in sustainable food systems. The floor is yours, Sergei.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for nice introduction. You can hear me, if not, scream. Yeah, I'd like to talk about alternative proteins and also about general proteins as one of the main parts of the food diet, of the food system. And quite often talking about food system and what functions it has to deliver, and quite often comes to the proteins as something that we demand and something that we need to sustain our living. Hold on 1 second. Yep. I would like to take a few words about DIL. And DIL is a registered association of member companies, but at the same time, it's a research institute for more than 30 years working. And the way it's created, the way it operates, it's kind of an interference between the applied work with our member companies from one side, and also From another side, and I'm not afraid to tell that, being in the forefront of research in some areas of food production, food processing, food sustainability, alternative protein system sustainability, and so on and so forth. So we are combining these different aspects and working that like that, and see quite a big reason in doing that. In core competences come quite a wide range from the area of biomass production. We don't work much in agriculture, but on alternative ways to produce biomass, biotechnology, microbial proteins, and so on. And looking at the different aspects of safety, ethnicity, structure, processing, and of course sustainability with the data analysis. And where I will be taking that part, the final part in this perspective of today's talk. I'll try to make it short, as was announced, but still, you cannot talk about complex food systems in a short way. I am very happy the previous speakers introduced this topic very well. I'm just telling that a lot of decisions, a lot of activities are interlinked, and also, as John was talking today about the crisis, the geopolitical decisions and how that affects the food systems. We currently see that with the Ukraine-Russia war. Russia-Ukraine war, but also what we have to consider, of course, the proteins and where they're coming from. Coming back to the topic of alternative proteins or the sources of the proteins, it's not a new topic, and humanity have been working and trying to find and diversify food for all the history, starting from simple picking of food and fermentation and coagulation. One of the first activities where they enhance the protein quality, enhance the production. And also, John Ingvar mentioned quite directly, and he's completely right, that we are actually consuming foods and not the sources. But what is important to point also here is that the way and the foods we are consuming now are quite different, and expectations for the foods are quite different from those being 100 years ago, for example, a few hundred years ago. What the consumers actually demand now or look for, they look for the similarities to the highly protein or highly valuable products like meats, having the same texture, having the same structure, having the same pleasure at the end, and of course comes at the price. As you can see, global warming potential in the upper part, these products, the development of those products actually increasing overall tendency, not always in different conditions that should be always considered, but environmental impact increasing. And of course, when we want to recreate the meat in itself, still so far comes at the price. Could be potentially beneficial, but for now, that's what we have. In general, to wrap this part, I would say that there are quite a lot of protein sources, and the overall approach is actually to mimic the texture structure of the meat from one side and another side, and that is again important in terms of crisis, but we actually can consume quite a lot of protein sources out there to supply us, whenever this crisis and extreme events are coming. And it's super important to have this diversification and not to rely on one source. That is also been discussed already. So in general, we are quite a lot of products on the market. Some of them are already there, some of them upcoming, different technology readiness levels. So from this perspective, it looks quite positive as well. But what is important to see is to find the niches of those products and to bring it to sustainable food systems, whatever it is, because the systems are quite complex, and it cannot, by bringing one specific product, completely assure that it's going to be sustainable or not. A couple of words about specific roles of alternative proteins also in the diet is probably that there are essential and non-essential proteins, also conditional proteins, and animal foods have slightly higher essential amino acid supply, a high possibility to supply essential amino acids. This is a relative contribution, but in general, because they have a little bit more proteins and a little bit more of those are essential, meaning those proteins which we cannot synthesize in our body and have to consume from outside, their value is a little bit higher. And this is not only about the proteins, but also other microelements, and so it's quite a valuable source. But on the other hand, also it comes at the high price, economical price. When we honestly will be putting all the prices on the production, the price will be quite high. But also in terms of the environmental impact, as you can see here, and it's quite known as nothing new. That's why there is quite a good scope for the intrusion of alternative proteins, which might have the same amount of essential amino acids, or even higher sometimes. But looking back a little bit on environmental impact, and we try to collect the data all the time and summarize and see what are where they stand against other protein sources, and what are their roles. For example, for global warming potential, you can see the gray dots are for the 1 kilogram of product, and the black dots are for 1 kilogram of proteins from different sources. And you can see there is very hard to make very specific conclusion. Also for alternative, but also not for alternative proteins, except for maybe animal-based beef products are quite high in terms of global warming potential. Other parts is in many cases are quite similar. So what it says that conventional and alternative proteins can be produced at relatively low environmental impact. So there are some cases, and that's something to look after, not just saying, okay, we cut out all the meat. Probably not a good idea. But actually to diversify and find those niches where the production actually makes sense from environmental perspective. And there, of course, more data. I cannot put all here in general statement that for some of the components like water footprint, we cannot completely make conclusion because of some challenges also in evaluation. On the other hand, for non-renewable energy, animal-based products actually have higher impact, and that's pretty much clear. But I would probably go on with the further and leave this for discussion. And I promised to tell a couple of words about this, the new crisis, also partially because I'm Ukrainian and just came yesterday from Ukrainian-Polish border. And I can say that that's something definitely what we could expect. It's and we already know, and we already see that there will be price increase into all the food products more or less, and also for those coming from protein sources and also coming from the crops, and of course, when the crops are increasing prices, the meat will also increase. So it's all interconnected systems, and we can expect the increase of prices. I cannot tell now. It would highly depend on how long it will all last and what will be the consequences. But the point is, the system should be diversified, and that's where any type of alternatives out there, algae production, insects for the food, plant-based proteins, lab-grown meat is far away, but could happen as well that they should be out there also from this perspective. And when the prices increases, that suddenly these sources become quite feasible in terms also of price of being used as protein sources. Yeah. A little bit on the future prospects. First of all, any protein sources on alternative protein sources should find their integration in the food system, should find their niche, and should be also ready for the deployment in terms of a crisis. There is a specific role in diversification of the protein sources. We should not rely on the 2, 3, 5 main, but we should have 20, 30 of those. And of course, we should seek for those which bring reduction in the cost and environmental impact. And risk events, as we will see, we saw it from the COVID situation, and we will see it more from the situation right now, that there is integration forced from alternative protein sources to be included in the diet. And with this, I would like to wrap it up my short talk, and hopefully I wasn't taking too much time.
Absolutely not. Thank you so much, Sergey. That's fascinating. Any questions or clarifications for Sergey? Otherwise, we'll move to the next speaker, which is Andrew. Yeah, I see you there on the screen. So we're very excited to hear from our next speaker, Andrew Weston. Andrew is a Senior Public Affairs and Campaigns Manager at the Co-op, and responsible for the Co-op's public affairs and driving the co-op's campaigning agenda. So in his talk, Andrew will highlight the retailer's perspective, and he will talk us through his views on why transformation is needed, but also what the reasons are why co-op engages with the theme of sustainable food systems, and in fact answering the question, what's in it for co-op? So despite the tremendous importance that retailers play in food systems and food system transformation, they're not often invited around a more academic discussion table, and hence we're very pleased to hear from Andrew on this occasion. So the floor is yours, Andrew.
Thanks, Pauline. After that introduction, I'm feeling slightly nervous, but it's a real pleasure to be here with you all. As Pauline was saying, my name's Andrew Weston. I'm from the Co-op Group. Based here in the UK, we trace our roots back to being the oldest cooperative business in the world, and we're still one of the biggest co-ops in the UK today. We're a major food retailer. For those of you that don't know us so well, we've got about 2,600 stores across the UK, but we're a food wholesaler too, supplying to a further 5,300 stores, including independent convenience retailers, again, all here in the UK. So it's a pleasure to follow on from so many esteemed speakers and really interesting comments so far. I'm going to do my best to bring a bit of a commercial perspective on why that transformational change in the food system outcomes that John articulated so clearly is required, what we're doing about it so far, and where there's more to do. So I think I'd start by saying I agree with the others who have referenced the role that the pandemic has played in revealing the size, the scale, the complexity of the food supply chain, its strengths and its vulnerabilities. But let me just talk, given time is short, to one of the challenges we've got to face into as to why we need to see that transformational change and focus on climate just for a moment. So we know from the IPCC report last August that as a result of humankind, global heating is happening, that without urgent action, we will not limit the increase of global temperatures to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. At 1.1 degrees of global warming that we're seeing already compared with pre-industrial levels, we are already seeing that impact in every region of the Earth in multiple ways. And we know that if we only manage to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees of warming, we will still need to invest in adapting to and mitigating the impacts from more intense rainfall and flooding to sea level rises to more extreme heat and droughts. And there are two reasons that this really matters to us here at Co-op: justice and economics. So we already hear from our producers and suppliers in the global south who are on the front line of experiencing the existing impacts of global heating. And it cannot be right that those who contribute the least to the advance of the climate crisis and can least afford to adapt to its effects are already experiencing the worst of the impact already. That's the justice point. On the economics, we know that at 2 degrees of global heating, there's a particular vulnerability for agriculture and therefore our food business. Weather extremes will be more severe, the impact on biodiversity and nature more acute, water scarcity becomes a real concern, and that impact is going to be felt through our supply chain. That's a really critical issue for all of us, right? And I've talked about the central role that food plays in our lives for both people, the generations who come after us around the world, and of course the planet. So we need to ensure that everybody involved in the food industry is facing into this huge challenge. Let me touch on something of what we're doing about it, because there's no denying that food retailers have enormous influence and power in driving change, given the share of calories consumed that we sell, the size and the scale of the businesses that we operate. But for balance, there's also no denying the incredibly strong constraints that limit commercial organisations from driving that kind of transformational change that we will need to see if we're to tackle the climate, biodiversity and health challenges alone. Ultimately, the industry as a whole, and especially once you get to the retail element of the value chain, is an incredibly competitive environment. So that, coupled with the market forces at play, the important role that consumer behaviour plays, means that we're limited in what we can do as an individual business, even if we are a big individual business. So to my mind, within that balance and that tension, there are three different kinds of levers that we can pull to drive change. Our day-to-day practices, how we run business as usual, the programs that we initiate and that we run, how we drive change, and critically, particularly from where I'm sat within our business, our positioning with government and governments. So let me just take those in turn. So let me talk to what we're doing in terms of our practices of our sourcing. Here at Co-op, we set out our priority sourcing commitments, our ethical and sustainability commitments, if you want to put it another way, in our future of food ambition. And the point of that work is to inspire our colleagues, our customers, our suppliers to take action together towards a healthier and more sustainable future. That ambition guides how every single day we source and create co-op products. So our sourcing policies, our packaging innovations, our fundamental work to build healthy, sustainable products, to how we treat people in our supply chains and work together with our customers to make choices that are better for the planet easier. Talking about nudging healthy, sustainable behaviours as an example there. Fundamentally, that's really important because the products we sell impact millions of people, communities around the world, as well as the planet. So from the people growing the ingredients for our food to the farmers and manufacturers making the products to everyone at home. That's why we're working harder to make our products different, which has really been a core part of Co-op's identity and DNA all the way through the decades. One of the examples that we're best known for is our support for fair trade. I was talking about the impact of climate change in the global south, but we know that smallholder farmers in the global south contribute amongst the least of the advance of global heating, but are disproportionately affected by climate change. I've got to say that's a moral outrage, but on a practical level, we have to ask how we can expect communities to take steps to address the climate crisis, thinking about mitigation as much as anything else, if they can't afford basic human rights like a nutritious diet in the first place. So as a retailer, one of the most significant things we can therefore do on this journey is make sure that we can continue to put fair trade products on our shelves and promote the benefits of that accreditation and that different way of doing business. That's our day-to-day. Ultimately, it's about the products that we put on the shelves. What about our programs and how we drive change? So just sticking with fair trade as an example, one of the things that we're doing is investing in Fair Trade Africa's climate strategy over the next 3 years. That's a £3 million partnership. It's all about equipping fair trade producers on the front lines to take steps to mitigate the impacts of climate change in their communities. Another thing that we've recently launched is our Carbon Innovation Fund. It takes the levy that we charge on our single-use carrier bags and is investing in projects that will support food and farming communities in tackling the climate crisis by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's about trying to identify and scale innovation. But there's more too, and this talks not just to the environment side, but also the health and inequality in communities here in the UK side as well. Being a member-owned business shaped by purpose rather than profit does allow us to do things differently. When our members shop with us, for every £1 spent, 2p goes back to local communities through our local community fund. We've just expanded the scope of that scheme, so in addition to the really valuable work with young people, with helping those that are struggling with access to food and various other grassroots organisations, we've just expanded that. So community groups who are tackling carbon emissions and helping the environment will also be able to apply for funding. That fund pays out to thousands of community causes every year, tens of millions of pounds over recent years that funding has provided. That really hyper-local level grassroots organisations, I think that's really critical because we know how significant consumer behaviour change is going to be as we try to move to a more sustainable food system. So then our positioning, and I think, I touched on some of the limitations of our influence, but there's no denying that we've got scale and we've got a privileged position with the food system as the link between those producing and manufacturing food and those who are buying, consuming, enjoying even all the fruits of that labour. So in that context, how we position ourselves with government and how we use our influence is also really critical. Sticking with climate as a bit of a theme, we've committed to being a net zero business by 2040 for our operations, but the products and services we sell too, that is a transformational target. It'll have a really far-reaching impact into how we operate, but it is a robust target assured by the SBTi. Now, when we set out our blueprint last year about how we're going to achieve that target, we were very clear that this is a journey we're on, but it's a journey we need to be joined on by others. And that's why a core part of our journey to net zero is campaigning and lobbying government for interventions that will drive a further and faster progress towards net zero across a more sustainable food system. Anna talked about the challenges facing policymakers in this space. I agree with everything that she observed, but one of the measures that I touched on and we can talk about more in the discussion is one of the things governments should introduce. UK government have signalled their intention to do this, but we're not seeing the detail, is to introduce a requirement that all businesses should be required to measure and publish their full end-to-end carbon footprints. Now, here at Co-op, we've massively reduced our operational carbon footprint, something like 70% since 2006. We've got stretching short-term targets on both our Scope 1 and 2 and our Scope 3 carbon footprints. But if you're not measuring and reporting that carbon footprint, you don't know where your impacts are. My question would be how businesses can possibly play their part in taking material steps to address the impact they're having. I'm out of time. There's much more for us to do. I suppose what I would say is it's one thing to be measuring impact and setting target, but riddled with complexity as much of doing both of those things are in practice. The scale of the challenge to reduce the impact and driving the change is far greater. So the key point I'm making here as I finish is that every business needs to be starting off on this journey, whether they're large or whether they're small, and policymakers need to be helping us with interventions that will level the playing field competitively and ensure that progressive businesses are not being penalised for taking action to drive progress towards healthier and more sustainable diets.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's great, and it's so nice to get your insights on this matter as well. Do we have any quick questions for Andrew? If not, we move to the final talk for today before we go over to the panel discussion, which is by Norbert-Munns. So Leonard has a background in food demand economics, and he started his career working in Malta in the public administration before moving to the private sector. But then in 2007, he joined the European Commission, first the DG Agriculture and Rural Development, and later in 2017, he joined the DG DEFCO, and in that role, he's here with us today. So in his talk, Leonard will focus on the farm to fork strategy and given the various disruptions going on in the world at the moment, he will also comment on the relative importance of food systems in light of climate change mitigation. So Leonard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pauline, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure. We're trying to do a marathon on food systems and geopolitics in 5 minutes, which does a disservice to the complexity of food systems. I have been working in DG INTPA now for the past 5 years. So as you said, I come from agriculture, and what all the speakers before me spoke about. First of all, as European Union, we have a baseline, which is the EU Green Deal Farm to Fork strategy. But we also have a biodiversity strategy, Fit for 55. So first of all, and John mentioned it, it's the systems approach of thinking. And what is complicated, however, is operationalization of this, because most of you spoke about the EU or UK. Imagine if you want to operationalize this in the DRC of Congo, or in Burkina Faso, or in Chad. So first of all, how complex food systems relate between the EU, US, and the geopolitics of all this, because as Sergey said, our top priority at the moment is to see the fallout of the Ukrainian situation and impact on cereals and feedstocks and fertilizer input costs, because this will have major implications given the share of the two countries, not only in Turkey or Egypt, but in the rest of the globe. But also how spillover effects impact third countries. And my focus will be on the beyond. Because I felt that the beyond aspect of this presentation was a bit not tackled sufficiently in detail. So first of all, I enjoyed hearing Andrew, because I am often invited to speak to the fair trade organizations. But my problem, Andrew, is do we have baselines to show fair trade spillover effects on justice to small farm holders in cocoa, in vanilla, in tea, amongst others? Because the willingness to pay dimension of European consumers, and I have the example of bananas. It's not in Co-op, it was on one of the cost cutters in Germany. There was a 20 cents, euro cents premium on fair trade. European consumers, in this case German consumers, were not willing to pay that premium. Why? Because it is a price cutter. It's a cost cutting. So first question to ask is, how much are European, UK consumers willing to pay for fair trade? For fair trade, plus rainforest, plus organic, because that is one of the problems, the additionality of all standard setting from a voluntary approach. And that is what the EU Green Deal is trying to do. The voluntary approach or the piecemeal approach of voluntarism is over. We have to go to a regulatory approach. If we want to do systems changing, we have to go horizontal regulation approach. This is what the deforestation free value chains proposal is, which is now in interinstitutional debate between the Parliament, the European Council, the Council of Ministers, which are the ministers across the different parts of the departments in the European Union, and the Commission, and then recently, the last week, due diligence, corporate due diligence. Because we need to go beyond the ESG, the nice ESG or greenwashing. There is so much greenwashing out there that it is not sufficient. And we have lots of reports, we have lots of analysis, we have lots of plans. The question is, beyond behavioral economics, what can be done, systems thinking, to make real change in national pathways? We came out from the UN Food Systems Summit a few months ago, from the Nutrition for Growth. And unfortunately, first of all, the big question to ask is, what is the cost of systems thinking in food? This is not cost-free. And outside there are other priorities, not least on the pandemic, on COVID. So first of all, the situation in 2022 is totally different from 10, 12 years ago when we had the food crisis. 12 years ago, there was big billions being pumped in food systems. Today, there are no big billions being pumped in food systems because the billions are being pumped into health systems and into basically manufacturing capacity of vaccines. The other thing is governance. We didn't much discuss governance at a local, at a regional, and a global level. If we don't get the governance right in a multi-stakeholder approach, what we are trying to do just on one value chain, cocoa, it is not easy process because we're trying to connect the cocoa farmer from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to the suppliers across the middle part of the value chain, to the retailers like Co-op, and to the final consumers. But to get a multi-stakeholder approach which tackles deforestation, including satellite systems for traceability purposes, to have living income, to have child labor-free value chains, that is not an easy process because that requires a demand-driven agenda of the governments. And luckily, we have Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, who have clearly made a signal of playing ball on this. But imagine if you have to do it on livestock, on soya, on palm oil, on coffee, on rubber, value chain by value chain across the globe. Many of you mentioned we go to a plant-based diet, fine. But what are you going to do on livestock and meat stakeholders, on vested interests, on exiting them from the value chain, on willingness to pay for fruit and vegetables? The healthy diet is not a cheap diet per se. So what are the costs of transitioning to a more plant-based diet? And what are the typology of production systems? The EU, for example, we as Directorate General are pushing agroecology. But we clash with the others. Agroecology is not something which is nice to the Americans or to the Chinese or to other parts. So we are also in a model across the globe where you have different operators offering different models, high input use or lower input use with agroecology practices. Now, the question is, the two models might coexist, but it's not easy for a government like, I don't know, Nigeria or Burkina, which has a high input vested interest in terms of the geopolitics, because we can speak about behavioral economics, but then it is the reality at country level in terms of vested interests of high input subsidies or non-smart subsidies, the case of Malawi, where you have vested interest to go, for example, only in maize. And last but not least, the humanitarian development peace nexus of food systems. We are confronting a crisis of proportional, almost biblical amounts. 155+ million are in acute food crisis. These are the Yemens, the Afghanistans, the DRCs, the Burkinas, the Sahels of this world. And hopefully we don't enter this close to our shores in the European context. But this is a reality because food systems and global food systems are more integrated across value chains. The moment you block or the Black Sea is blocked, there is a problem. There is a major problem of logistics, which will clearly having a spiraling effect on cereals. And this is clearly will have spillover effects on the humanitarian. We know that the humanitarian cost of food systems is high, very high. And then the issue of peace, we don't even need to discuss that. First, it has to be peace if you want to enter into the humanitarian and development dynamics. And last but not least, the de-risking of value chains. There is lack of risk appetite of financial institutions to invest in the innovative agri-food systems we are discussing. Why? Because it's complicated. It's complicated to tick the box of gender, of youth, of empowerment, of green, of adaptation, of transitioning. It's easier to invest in mega solar panels and mega renewable energy or digital rather than in inclusive, green, transformative food systems. And short of lower ODA for agri-food systems, it's the private sector which has to pick the price tag. If not, there won't be the major shift we are discussing. And that is also what we as a European Union are trying to do with our guarantees and our blending operations to actually nudge, to push financial institutions to risk on smaller ticket sizes. We have a small portfolio of around 200 to 150 million, but that's peanuts compared to what we require globally. So that also requires systems thinking with financial institutions, with the World Bank, with the IFCs, and with all of you, because I think we need also to de-risk food systems if we really want to do the fundamental change we have been discussing. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Leonard. That was great. A great talk to end this first bit. Are there any quick clarifications for Leonard? If not, then I think we might have eaten into our leg stretcher. But let's use the last half an hour for a nice panel discussion. There are lots of questions already coming in on the chat, and I've also been scribbling down a lot of questions for you. But I'd like to ask my colleague Rathana to kick off this panel discussion, as she has a question for the panel as well.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you to all of the speakers. Very rich conversations that we just had, and thank you so much to bring all of the level of complexity that we have with the global food system, the urgency to address the externality of the food system, especially like as well Leonard to bring the trade-off in such a way that yes, there are trade-offs and that those trade-offs need to be addressed and discussed. I like to kick with a question that kind of appeared already with the different speakers, and it's the question of that transformations. When we're talking about the net zero, when we're talking about the decarbonizations of the food system, for especially people that are not really aware about it, a lot of discussion is about how much it's going to cost, right? Are we really going to benefit more by transforming the food system? And when are we going to see those gains? And I would like to address that to speakers that feel confident to respond to that. So what could be the cost of the food system transformation, and what could it bring, and when do we see that kind of positive output? It's nice on the screen because I can see everyone. Thank you, Professor John.
So what's the cost of not achieving it? I think that's a more valuable question, because that really puts the thing into sharp to sharp headlight. Again, I go back to what exactly do you mean by the food system transformation? And I think it'll help the conversation enormously if we agree what actually we are trying to transform. And that's why my thesis was we're trying to transform the outcomes. We're trying to transform all of them, and that needs a negotiation because of all the things that Lena was saying about the different perspectives and different interests that are riddled across the system.
Thank you, Professor John Ingram. Francesca, I see your hands as well.
Yeah, so I agree with John. We need to transform the outcomes. When it comes to costs, I think it's also absolutely valuable, or we need to look at the measures because these will bring us to the outcomes that we want to achieve. And one of our mandates actually in the Food System Economics Commission is to estimate cost of action and compare it to cost of inaction. And our previous report by the Food and Land Use Coalition, one of our partners, the Growing Better report, happy to put it in the chat later, started to do that, and they tried to estimate the so-called hidden costs, like the costing the externalities, and they amounted to $12 trillion US. And so we tried to look more into that, and we tried to look specifically into the investments needed for those measures that we will identify that lead us then to those food system goals and objectives.
Thank you, Dr. Francesca. I can see one hand as well with Anna.
Yeah, I mean, I think I absolutely concur with John and Francisca that we have to start with the costs which are being which are attributed to not acting in the food system at the moment, those externalities. But also, I think I would sort of note really that there are often costs attributed to intervention in the system which turn out to be false. So I'll give you an example. Recently in the UK, we've introduced, like many countries, a sugar tax on soft drinks, and much of the industry in advance of the introduction of that tax said this was going to have really big impacts on jobs and so forth, and we're articulating some of those costs, which since the tax has been introduced have turned out not to be true. So I think, and then the other sort of piece of the jigsaw on cost, of course, is that we're already spending huge amounts of money on agricultural subsidies, and thinking about how we use that resource in a smarter way to help the transition occur from a sort of production perspective is another, potentially cost neutral, or at least a way of better aligning existing investments to deliver the outcomes that we need. So there are sort of multiple facets to the kind of cost question.
Also, to add, if I may, just to add that it's very hard to discuss the comparison of cost in terms of euros or dollars against the cost of well-being and feel good and all of that. And so what as Anna well knows, we're dealing with multiple currencies, and it's very hard to balance what I consider from my worldview better for animal welfare with the actual euro cost to an industry sector of introducing a sugar tax. And this is why this is one of the complications that Leonard was referring to, is that it's a combination of different world views as to what's important. And that's why it needs this negotiation.
Yes, I can see the hand of Ximena.
Hi, yeah, just to complement that, also it's about how we measure this cost. So it will be a matter of perspective, but in terms of framework, so short and long term, but also it's all about economic cost. And I think that is where probably a lot of the things went wrong, when we have this sort of economic cost at all the time, trying to measure things that not always we can see the cost today. And I think, again, this sort of maybe narrow view and this sort of difficulties and complexities that measuring the interaction of different factors, or this sort of holistic thinking, also sort of blur this decision making sometimes, and always driven from one side, and the connection with the power dynamics as well, how this sort of picture gets blurred, and how we measure things all the time with the same lens.
Thank you, Xamina, and thank you to all of the speakers for the depth of the response as well, and offering this very holistic response when we're thinking about cost or benefits. Pauline, would you like to take the floor for your questions too?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I saw I noted down something that I wanted to ask, and I see that Jeroen Kandel, one of our fellow BrIAS fellows, is asking something quite similar. So I'll combine the two. But in all your talks, fiscal policies feature quite highly, often as part of a more comprehensive package, but sometimes also as a sort of almost holy grail in trying to accelerate transformational change, and major driver both for consumers and industries, but also food production, wholesale and retailing. And so Jeroen is asking that various of you expressed a strong belief in the need for fiscal pricing interventions and reducing emissions. So to what, specifically for Andrew, he's asking, is this something that the co-op would be in favor of, in light of your comment about leveling the playing field? And to what extent, Leonard, is the EC considering pricing interventions? And perhaps for everyone, are these inevitable? And is it, if we look at the sort of more comprehensive package of interventions, is this one that weighs perhaps a little bit more than all the others together? Andrew, would you like to?
Do you want me to go first, Pauline? Yeah. Really great question. So I suppose where I'd start with is actually the observation Anna made about how emotive food is as a topic, and particularly here in the UK, I'd be really interested to hear if it's the same in other contexts across Europe. As soon as you start talking about taxing particular dietary choices in the work around the National Food Strategy Independent Review, it was very obvious just how strong the reaction was to that proposal. I suppose our take here would be, we've got to bring everybody on a journey, because it's no good us at the co-op increasing prices or only offering certain products if the remainder of the sector continues to meet a need from consumers and puts those products on their shelves at a lower price, or continues to range them if we take a principled decision to take them off a sale. So that's a slightly philosophical way of saying we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to further fiscal intervention, and within the suite of levers that need to be pulled, it's almost certainly one of those that ultimately needs to be reached for. But it can't be the only thing. So the answer can't just be to tax more, because the journey you'd have to take to decide what to tax would be incredibly complicated. But also the backlash that's going to provoke, unless you also do a whole load of work to bring consumers with you, means that I think you're very unlikely to achieve what it is you set out to try and accomplish through a pure tax.
Thank you. Leonard, would you like to comment?
Thanks, Pauline. Yes, I tried to explain a bit what we are trying to do in the chat. So trying to move into a systems approach around deforestation, around living income, and around reducing child labor in a value chain. Basically, the EU is positioning itself with the G20 countries, and we are often criticized that we are increasing the level of ambition and squeezing out operators in third countries. So there is a sort of higher social and environmental standard setting, which is what the EU Green Deal is trying to achieve. This would be through a regulatory approach, not through a voluntary standard setting. Also, there is this proposal on corporate due diligence. There are lots of benchmarking, including the World Benchmarking Alliance that the G7 under the UK outgoing presidency, this is on sustainable agri-value chains, which we are also looking at closely. The big question is, and this is the debate, for example, around pesticides and maximum residue levels. If we are super strict, more than the Codex Alimentarius on MRLs, and we squeeze out, as we often do, with higher interceptions for health, but also for environmental reasons. For example, under the approach of organic and more organic sourcing and less pesticide use, then you will have, as we are experiencing, a clash across the globe. One with vested interest in terms of the input industry, but also in terms of a more productionist approach in terms of policy making. Why? Because it's high input, high productivity use, high. This is a bit the production approach that is adopted by some of our international partners. So outside there, that's what I try to explain. If you are an African country or a Latin American country or an Asian developing country, you are confronted with two models. The high production model, and we didn't speak about India and the high input subsidies dependent on the Indian administration and how this has a geopolitical dimension in India, with also rioting. So how do you reconcile the subsidy dimension, including around food subsidies, input subsidies, and a more climate-oriented approach, which will take time? Food systems thinking and transformation might take years. It's not something which is immediate. Everyone spoke about shifting to meat, but how many are shifting away from meat? Reducing meat, yes, but it's not having a major impact on greenhouse gas emissions because you have a shift of the food consumption model of meat and dairy in the developing world. This is what we say, middle income Africa and parts of Asia and parts of Latin America will actually eat more dairy and more meat, even though Europe and the US will decrease it. So all this is a question of what is the role of the private sector, but also what is the role of global governance? Because whenever we go to G7, G20, making references to meat consumption is a no-go. Barely making references to environmental standard setting. So fine, we go to the COPs and the CBDs, but then the question is there the finance to follow up the commitments? And there is clearly a gap of finance, especially on adaptation to climate change. And this is what the big challenge is. It's not only the regulatory approach, which we are trying to lead, but also the finance, and the finance to adaptation more and than just mitigation.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
This Leonard's just been referring to what's called the emerging middle class, and over the next decade there's likely to be another 1.5 billion people whose financial circumstance goes from below $6,000 a year to above $6,000 a year, which is a definition. With that comes a change in diet, and the increase in high calorie or secondary calorie product is very well known as disposable income increases. And so the challenge, I think, is not, how we bring on alternative proteins, as Sergei was talking about, across OECD land, if I can call it that, but how do we actually implement that strategy across the emerging middle class? And that is a real challenge, because you see the fast food machine poised to capitalize, literally using that word, on the emerging middle class market. And then everything that Anna was saying about, how do we increase fruit and veg, how do we reduce high fat, sugar, salt, is going to be conflicting with a massive economic machine that is going to be emerging over the next couple of decades. We talk about today, problems today, but I was referring in my short talk what's coming down the track. And that is the health issue that Anna was referring to. It's the environmental issue, but it's also the political instability. Look at the food riots during the food price spikes, and Leonard has laid out the nature of the challenge. It's all very well, and we understand that there is this massive challenge, but what the hell do we do about it? And we can only approach it with a systems approach because we have to agree what the boundary is of the system and what is negotiating and what is negotiatable. And that's why it needs this, you know, a very large conversation about the system and a recognition that the system delivers more than food.
Thank you. There's a comment on the chat that maybe it would be nice to be thrown in that that there is a, oh sorry, no, it is from Andrew, that there's a question of equity running through all this. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes.
Pauline, I guess I was just really struck that in all of these tensions, it's equity is fundamentally a really big question, and that's not so much a commercial perspective, but what would just to be observers. We're talking about all of these challenges in quite a hypothetical sense.
Yeah.
John, I was really struck by your description of the short-term disruptions that the industry or the system faces. And I was struck by that because I was reflecting on the past couple of years and thinking that at any one time we had at least one of them, and at multiple points we've had kind of all four of those challenges to be facing into. I guess the complexity of what we're trying to do in terms of the transformation and in terms of the tensions and that negotiation that we've been discussing here, it feels almost like we're, I don't know, the industry players in this are F1 drivers racing around at 200 miles an hour whilst trying to change the engine because it's on fire at the same time as winning the race. I mean, I just can't describe the challenges of running the current machine and keeping food on the shelves and keeping the current system operating whilst also thinking about what the future looks like and the risk of not making the changes. I think we can all see, but how you do that in a practical sense, how you balance those questions of equity, how you face into the reality for so many families at the moment as costs of everything are rising. We can see that that's happening because of the issues within the system today, let alone the challenges we're going to see of the future. And that's, as Anna was reminding us, that's in the global north. I mean, just the difficulty of doing that as commercial operators in the current environment is enormous. And I just thought I'd reflect, Pauline, just briefly on the difficulty of finding the bandwidth and the space to do that thinking and to start changing practices when the issues are so acute in the day-to-day running of the business as it stands at the moment is perhaps just worth something to share there.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Rathana, would you like to?
Yes, I mean, with speakers that have so many different insight into the complexity of the food system, and I really like again to with what Professor John was talking about, the question about what is negotiable and what is not negotiable. So how much, according to you, over the last 15 years, 20 years, I have been working in the food system as well for the last 10 years. So how much of that common visions that is looking at future that are both sustainable and resilience do you think is actually bringing that equity factor? Or for me, I will discuss that more in terms of inclusiveness of that future. I know that is not an easy question to respond, and I know that individual and institution are two different things. So I won't point out anyone, but anyone that feel free to respond to that question.
On inclusiveness, what we try to do is, again, on cocoa, is to have all the operators across the value chain. So we have farmers, we have cooperatives, we have women-led organizations, we have youth, we have the grinders, we have the roasters, we have the co-op-like, so the retailers, we have the consumer end. Imagine, however, if we have to do this for 10, 11 value chains across the globe. Impossible. And one might ask, why did you choose chocolate and cocoa? We chose cocoa because the EU sources 65% of it from 2-3 countries. So we have a bit of a leveraging on one commodity. We don't have that leverage on coffee or on palm oil or on livestock. If you want governance of food systems and change within a food system, you need to sort of discipline the market. discipline the market by also providing signals and accompanying measures which are targeted. And this is time-consuming. If you want to support farmers' organizations in Côte d'Ivoire on cocoa and look into ecosystem services, one of the big challenges is how carbon sequestration gives a signal to ecosystem payments for smallholders. Unless I hear otherwise, we don't have silver bullets around this. There is so much finance, but it's not the small farm holders who has less than 1 hectare who are benefiting from these ecosystem services. It's the bigger operators. So that is an inclusiveness and equity issue. And what COVID has shown is we can't continue supporting the best in the class, because fine, the best in the class would probably already be market oriented. But what about the missing middle and the lower ones? Those who, if you don't support them, will go into jihadism in the Sahel, for example, or because there is disenchantment of youth in Africa. You know how many we need to create in Africa? 1 million jobs per month. Now, where are you going to create 1 million jobs per month in Africa? It will not be just in agriculture or agri-food systems. It will certainly not be in agri-food systems on its own, but it will not be in the services industries just on its own. It will be in a blend of which agri-food systems is one. So we need to give all the necessary tools, and that's what we are trying to do. Digital tools, e-commerce applications, empowerment. But most of the problems that we encounter is empowerment, justice, and inclusiveness, because many small operators feel squeezed out. So the missing part is clearly the financing part, because if you don't get the finance to do scalability of these operations, then it will be a project-based approach. And what we need is from a target like this is the evidence around ecosystem services to small farm holders, the evidence around systems thinking, which is inclusive. The fair trade case of Andrew. What is the premium that you give to the fair trade operators in Africa? Is it 10, 15%? Is it 20%? Is it capped? Is there a carrot around that? Is there a transformation around that? Because we know fair trade is simply remains a niche. If you go to the UK or Belgian market here, you don't find fair trade all over the place, to be honest. It remains niche. It remains 5, 10%. If you are lucky, and it's very commodity specific. Fair trade bananas, fair trade chocolate, but it's not, and it's costly. So if you are in food price inflation mode, a normal consumer will not go into fair trade mode. They will go to the cheaper option. So all these need to be factored in terms of transmission effects to the small farm holders, to the women-led organizations, to the youth organizations, because the generational dimension is important, especially in Africa.
Thank you, Leonard, and please, yes, John.
Let's not forget that a lot of the agricultural product is not going into food directly. 2/3 of cereals in Europe goes into animal feed. 2/3 of cereals globally goes into animal feed. 20% of cereals globally goes into biofuel and other industrial process. So if one's looking to ramp down the demand side of the equation, as opposed to forever boosting the production side of the equation, my mantra is we need to meet demand where people don't have enough, but we need to manage demand where we are taking too much. And so what are the opportunities, which are political and economic, for ramping down the amount that goes into biofuels, for ramping down the amount that goes into animal feed? And that, of course, is the other half of the question of what's the best animal production system, and then best for whom? And so here we go into the negotiation. But I mean, the job for the next decade is how to manage the burgeoning demand of the food sector, not to forget we still need to meet the demand of the billion or so people who don't have enough. But the political agenda is focused on the meet those who don't have enough, because that gives easy political wins. The challenge that you've been talking about, the political challenge of telling us to eat less, whew, you know, this is what Anna was saying, is very real, but it's got to be addressed.
Thank you, John, and I see Ximena, yes.
Sorry, before we close, I was just trying to think about what Leonard was saying and how we make it more mainstream, this fair trade, or, you know, a more like a better production of food, and those that are inclusive for the producer, how we make it available and accessible and affordable for everyone. Because like you said, now it's still very niche, it's still for the upper class, it's still for those that who pay the premium that not necessarily get to those that need that premium. So sorry about my dog. So yeah, I think that is also the other challenge that I feel is difficult to put together when you are a consumer and when also the producers.
Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got 1 minute left, and I've got about 16 questions I still want to ask. But just sorry, John, did you want to ask?
Excuse me, I've got to jump onto something else at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, no, exactly. So let's finish this discussion for now. There's a lot of different things to follow up on, and I think we brought together a very interesting group of speakers here. I really would like to thank you all once more for your time and your very interesting insights from so many different angles. I'm not entirely not sure if I've ever been on in a group or panel discussion with where we had people from so many different parts of the food system, academia, industry, think tanks, etc. And I will also share with you the comments on the chat, because there were lots and lots and lots of questions that we didn't get to, including, I think, from Rathana and myself. So we will share those, and who knows, we can continue the discussion a bit on paper.
Great.
For now, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye bye, everybody.
And see you all soon.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.